All right, so today we are going to be talking about what essentially is the future of the European Union, or the future of Europe, generally speaking. This is a little bit after the fact of the breaking story last week of the UK voting to leave the European Union, but we're following it from the perspective of seeing what comes next. So obviously, at this point, we know the news. The UK voted to leave the EU. But what is this going to mean for the rest of Europe? What is it going to mean for the UK? What are some likely outcomes of this? And what are some of the peripheral issues that are going on related to it? So, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, before we look at where we go from here, we need to understand why this happened to begin with. And there's a lot of misinformation going on with regards to why.
Well, I thought it was clear. It's neo-Nazi xenophobic hatred, right?
Yes, the neo-Confederates immigrated to the United Kingdom and took over, apparently. No, that's one of the reasons why this happened, is that you have a block of people in the United Kingdom, and according to the statistics, it was middle-aged to older people mostly that voted to leave, who had see, the young people there never knew life outside of the European Union. So you have the older generations who knew what it was like knew what it was like under, say, Margaret Thatcher, and they have a sense of wanting to get back to that. And the so the
I
pro-
would interject there quickly. Also, I would point out that it seems a lot of the youth have this painted view of that era as well. So when one generation is saying, when implying they'd like to get back to the way it was, in a lot of people's minds in the youth, that means, well, we're going against progress. We're going back to this, evil, patriarchal, racist society, because it's kind of this, I think, the propaganda that has been propelled on them from that.
and I believe that to be true. You have the young generation who think that, I've seen it. You have younger people, or even older people who voted to remain, who think that leaving the European Union, somehow the United Kingdom will become a cultural and economic isolationist country, that they won't be able to buy bananas anymore because the apparently the United Kingdom will just be an island in the middle of the world. And if you look at what the pro leave campaign states, they made it clear that they want to engage with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world with trade, and they simply want to control who goes in and who goes out, and they want to engage in trade deals that make the most sense for them. And the young people there, sort of like young people in, say, the United States, have grown up in a situation where all they know is they don't know economic prosperity, and older generations do, and or at least some semblance of prosperity.
And I think you just touched on having control of who comes in, who leaves, etc. It really does seem like migration and trade were absolutely critical in this vote. Those seem to be the really deciding factors.
Absolutely. And the thing is that what people have to realize is that most of the trade, the import, the export regulations, all right now in the European Union, all come out of Brussels. So when the people of the United Kingdom elect members of the European Parliament, they don't, there's no it would be like in the United States, instead of electing your congressman or your senator to go to Washington, it would be like instead of electing them to go to Washington, they would go to Mexico City and then they would just be one of 500 or 1,000 members of the North American Union, and potentially people in, say, Nevada would be regulated out of Mexico City, even if those people doing economic activity would not even leave the United States. And this is about having more local control for the people of Britain, and in terms of economics. I mean, I think that's the biggest misconception. I mean, is the economic part, and people point to, right now we see, the credit rating for the United Kingdom has been downgraded, and stocks are tanking, and the market is very bearish right now. And people say, well, it's obviously bad. Well, the market's like stability, and these things have a way of correcting themselves over time.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, 43 years in the European Union. Or the UK has been in the European Union. So this is a big event. People are not taking it very well. Some people are not taking it very
Right.
well. We have John Kerry saying Brexit might not even happen. We have people calling for a second referendum. We've seen rallies in Scotland and London. There's the hashtag London Stays movement. I've seen protesters with picket signs demanding open borders. There's a petition that's floating around that has, they're now making a big deal of it in the media. There's 4 million people apparently who have signed this petition who want to revote, which I find very funny because, number one, I've already seen it taken apart that quite a number of the people who signed this petition, because it's an online petition, did it from outside of the UK.
Yeah, right. They had no. I mean, people from South Korea were signing
Yeah,
this.
exactly. So it's obviously invalid, but let's just assume that 4 million people actually did sign it. The UK has a population, I think, of around 65 million. So I don't see that as being major news personally, but I think that it's being spun. And this very idea that you could actually lend credence to revoting on a referendum just because people are upset with it. It's phenomenally interesting to see how this is playing out.
Well, that's the great thing about democracy, is that when you don't get what you want, you just have a revote until you do.
Yeah, and we've seen the EU use this tactic before.
Absolutely.
So, what are some further thoughts? And before I talk about some of my ideas of where the Europe is headed, what talking about maybe the background? You were just speaking about the background. What are some further thoughts here?
Well, the United Kingdom has, like any other member of the European Union, has been buried in bureaucracy and regulation. And, when somebody in London who starts up a small business that they're going to just sell, widgets to other people in London, but it doesn't go beyond that, but yet they have to abide by more regulations coming out of Brussels than they do, in London or anywhere else. That's a problem, and people resent that. People want more local control, but they also don't want other countries telling them how to live their lives. I mean, in a way, this is a nationalist movement, but it's not. I've seen people say that this is how Germany started, and liking this to World War II,
Yeah.
and it's crazy. I mean, we can talk about this later, but there is a, a leaked, from the French and German foreign ministers, a leaked document saying that they have plans to make a European superstate. And if anything, that is more akin to Germany prior to World War II than the United Kingdom. I mean, Hitler was all about centralized power. He did not like small collectives. He wanted everything. So I mean, this is a positive nationalist movement, and people aren't seeing that.
I think that you can actually go further and take it away from Nazi Germany, although you're correct in saying what you said about Nazi Germany. But the European Union seems to be headed in a direction that is much more akin to another certain union that existed not too long ago in a very close related geographic location. Um, it seems like yes, there's this powerful centralized authority. There is it is, and I want to get away from the idea of nationalism as being a dirty word. It is a word that's really used inappropriately. A lot of people use nationalism as a term to be synonymous with neo-Nazism, racial supremacists, etc., etc. Nationalism is not can be paired with those things, of course, but it can be paired with a great number of things, and essentially is at its basic form standing up and saying, hey, our nation is good. I like what we're doing here. We should have more of this. It doesn't necessarily mean that you want to start a war. It doesn't necessarily mean that you think other people are inferior. You just stand up for your own national identity. And I think the reason that that's really put down is because it is very much in the face of globalism. And right now we're in a trend that is worldwide endorsing the idea of everybody must be part of this global agenda, and that ties in back with the centralization, because if we see how in the European Union we have everything centered in Brussels, you say, well, how can Brussels determine how we should regulate the market in Wales or in southern Spain or wherever it may be? That centralization, the nuance is lost when you have that kind of centralization if it's a firm centralization on things like regulations. So they have no ability to self-govern, essentially. And that causes a lot of tension. I mean, we even see it in the United States when things come down from D.C., the flyover country, a lot of the red states feel quite resentful of the fact that they're being given very specific, very sometimes intrusive orders from D.C., which seems to be incredibly far removed from the everyday lives of Americans. So I think that on the global scene, we see this strong centralization of power and authority, whether it's the EU, the United States, they're all involved in it. But overall, it seems like the powers that be would like to work us towards a system where we are all under the central authority of some global governing body, or at least close to global, almost everybody on board, and anything that gets in the way of that, nationalism or any kind of sense of personal pride in your local community, seems to be a target.
Absolutely. And for every example of people think of nationalism as negative, they point to Germany prior to World War II or Italy. But for every one of those examples, you can point to examples of nationalist movements that people don't have a problem with or didn't have a problem with. Look at India, breaking away from the British Empire. I mean, do people regard Gandhi as some kind of nationalist racist because he wanted India to have control over its own destiny and not be controlled by another state that was hundreds of miles away or thousands of miles away? I mean, the nationalism can be a force for good, for the common people, as it could be for negative. I mean, it's nationalism. People have this negative connotation of it. Nationalism, in and of itself, is not. I would actually argue that nationalism has a greater benefit to individual human rights than globalism will. I mean, obviously, the individual is the most important, but yeah, people
Well,
have this fundamental misunderstanding of the concept of nationalism.
that you touched on something very interesting there. You said that obviously the individual is the most important unit or something like that, and that's not obvious for a very large number of people. The Western tradition, as we know it, has been founded on upholding individualism and moving towards the individual rights rather than the collective. But that is not the norm for most of the world, and it would seem that Western civilization now has been embracing more and more and more of the collectivist approach.
Right, and uh, that is the danger that people fall into. And you know, if we look at, I mean, let's look at, I mean, just going back to the economics for a minute, we see that like Switzerland, people don't, a lot of people don't realize this, at least people outside of Europe don't realize that Switzerland is not a member of the European Union. In fact, it's not even a member of the European Economic Area. It simply has a trade agreement with the European Union, and it's doing well economically. The Swiss are very proud of their country, their culture, and they granted they are part of the the free movement of people, so they do have immigration issues, but that's due to the trade agreement that they signed. But overall, they're very proud. In every referendum that comes up, they reject it to join the European Economic Area or the European Union because they know that they are they're proud of their country. They do not want Brussels to run how they live their lives. They like the concept of self-determination, which is kind of unique because a lot of when we think of self-determination and individualism and rationalism, we don't think of Switzerland. We think of, we think of England, we think of France. We don't think of these countries that are sort of taking it upon themselves to almost take over the mantle now.
Well, that's because Switzerland doesn't make a lot of noise. They stay kind of in the margins. They don't like to get involved in things, and they've been very successful doing it.
Well, that's right, and they nobody complains about their economy. I mean, the European Union has regulations on banana sizes of bananas. For anybody interested, go to YouTube and look up Brexit the movie, and it lays an outline of how many regulations from the time you wake up to the time you leave for work in the morning, just going through your morning routine, and there's thousands of regulations coming out of Brussels, and that doesn't include anything local or anything countrywide. And the idea the idea that somebody outside of your country or your political unit is going to tell you what they think is better for you and is just madness. And I think the United Kingdom, not all of the United Kingdom, of course, Northern Ireland and Scotland being the two big areas that voted to remain. I mean, the people in the United Kingdom are seeing this.
Yeah,
So I don't know if you want to talk about those two and what's going on there.
in Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Yes.
Oh yes, just in just a moment. But I want to reiterate something that you touched on with Gandhi. I just want to show the kind of hypocrisy that we see, and it's so often that the media and the establishment will use hypocritical tactics. Right, so they'll say, well, this is wrong, look at what they're doing, and then they'll do the exact same thing, and that's perfectly fine. We don't want to talk about that. So when we're talking about nationalism, yeah, is nationalism only bad when Westerners do it? Because I haven't heard anybody talking ill about Gandhi anytime recently. In fact, the entire anti-colonial movement in the starting in the after World War One, really, but taking off rapidly in the post-war era, all those countries gaining their independence, that's nationalism. So would it be better to say, well, Africa should have stayed colonial? I mean, because that's the same argument. If we're saying that, well, you should stay in the EU or you should accept central authority in Washington, whatever it may be, you're saying that's the way it should be. Well, does that apply to other situations? And if not, why not? Because it doesn't seem like it's really that different if the UK votes to leave democratically and they are a democracy. Why is this a major problem? And I think that is where you will see the cracks in the narrative. That's where the propaganda becomes obvious, because they will, in textbooks, you can see volume after volume after volume about how wonderful it is that the colonies declared independence in the post-war era. But things like this, when there's cracks in I guess a more progressive or regressive political system, then it's not tolerable. Um,
That's right. And just so people understand that, whether it's in the United Kingdom or the United States, I mean, nationalism is not just the nationalism that comes out of the Western tradition is backed by principles of the English Enlightenment. This isn't just I want to be nationalist because I don't like other people. There's a core philosophy behind it, going back to self-determination. And this isn't something that people decided on willy-nilly. I mean, this is just like Gandhi had a core philosophy at his approach to nationalism, so do people in the United Kingdom.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that there's something that's very fundamental. Again, I want to touch on dichotomous thinking. This is the major, major, major problem for modern people. And that is if you say I'm a nationalist or if you act as a nationalist, a lot of people are nationalists and they don't even self-identify as it because it's a dirty word or they don't fully understand what it means. But if you say, I like the way we do things here, I would like to promote that, then that fundamentally means to so many people who are devoid of logical thinking that you inherently then want to tear other people down. It's like saying, well, why are you working out and taking care of yourself? Do you have a problem with people who are out of shape? It's a complete logical fallacy, but it's used constantly to silence political dissidents. They say, well, why would you do that? You must also want this. If you believe that you should close open border immigration, that means that you hate all people of a certain ethnicity. It's completely ridiculous. But people operate thinking along these lines. In fact, it seems like the majority of people these days think along those lines. You have to either be 100% on board with something and everything that's associated with it, or you are our enemy. And I think that it's a very dangerous way of thinking to be stuck in.
Well, that's right, and I mean, we can talk about this another day, but I think that's the fundamental problem, the just the fatal problem of multiculturalism. In fact, people view this, and I don't think the immigration issue was the number one issue behind this, although it was important to a lot of people. But the thing is that when people people in the United Kingdom understand that there are cultures that are superior to others, and I think there's the fundamental problem with multiculturalism, which has infected Europe just as it is infecting the United States, is that you cannot criticize any other culture. And regardless of the culture, I mean, cultures that that treat women as slaves or boil gay people alive are no worse than Western culture.
Well, no, I've got to stop you there. I think that you're incorrect. I think that the actual narrative is that it is okay to attack certain cultures as long as they are Western cultures. You can attack them.
That's true.
So it is not completely relative. If it was completely relative, there would be a vast number of nihilists walking the streets, but it's not the case. We have instead people who have been conditioned to purely hate their own culture, all of the freedoms and all of the wonderful amenities that have been given to them due to thousands of years or from thousands of years of blood, sweat, and tears. They are taught to then hate that and tear it down without any, because they're so ignorant, they don't understand what would possibly replace it. They just assume that it would be some utopian society instead of something that would be absolutely horrible.
That's right.
So yeah, old people. Let's get back on the before we will digress very quickly on multiculturalism, as we'll probably have a lot to say about that in the future, as always. But so yeah, the attacks, the denigrating attacks that we see. So it was the old people that wanted to leave. It's those old people. They just don't care about the youth. They want to sabotage us all. It reminds me very much of the kind of political unrest we're seeing in the United States, as far as how we have these floods of righteously indignant youth that come out onto the streets and protest with absolute ignorance about what they're very angry. They'd be willing to hurt people over it, but they have no idea what they're talking about. So there's that.
Well, and well, don't you see that the elderly, the middle aged, they don't have to deal with the horrible economic apocalypse that will happen from the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. So that's why they voted for it, because they're like, well, I'm only going to be around for another couple of years. Or apparently that's, but no, I mean, it's funny because I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Scottish independence referendum in 2014 that was voted down, uh, the elderly or the older generations, at least middle age, were blamed for voting against Scotland leaving. So the older generations get blamed for wanting to leave the European Union, but they also get blamed for not voting for Scottish independence. I mean, which is it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I don't have the demographics on that vote, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to have that confirmed. Um, so we have what happens next. Essentially, we have the UK is now set to leave, and in spite of all of these people saying that it's not going to happen, we're going to change it, we're going to have another referendum, or we'll find some stipulation. As far as I'm concerned, if either the EU or anybody in the British government at this point, if they try to throw a wrench into the gears, it's going to turn into widespread chaos. You're going to have rioting because I don't think people are in the mood at this point to put up with any nonsense. Essentially, you have the growing right-wing movements across Europe, and the UK is no different. They're not in a majority, but I think that if something came in, if somebody tried to say, well, you had a Democratic vote, but we're just going to ignore it, or we're going to have another vote until you vote the right way, I think that it would swell the ranks of the so-called radical right, or what really is oftentimes the center right. It would grow their ranks very, very quickly. So I'm not sure if anybody in positions of authority is willing to take that step. If they're intelligent, they could, of course, try to do it and make the right wing political groups look bad. Try to do a PR move against them, but I kind of think that they're not going to do that. I think that the UK will leave.
Yeah, it's tough for me to say for sure. I'm mostly in agreement with you, but in some ways I'm just such a skeptic of the establishment, the elite. They will do anything to, because I think if the United Kingdom is successful at this, you will see others fall in line. I mean, you imagine yourself as the working class in France, which does have a strong independence movement going on now, and you're saying, well, why can't we have that? I mean, this will swell into other countries, but at the same time, I mean, we'll see. It'll be interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't made up my mind yet on what will happen, but I know it'll take a year or two to actually do it. But I think what may happen is any sort of catastrophe, whether it's God forbid, a terror attack or space aliens or something that happens in the United Kingdom from now basically from now till maybe even 10, 20 years from now will be blamed on this referendum
Yeah.
if it goes through. And if it happens before they actually separate, then you may see a massive movement to try to stop it. We told you this terrorist attack happened. Letting in terrorists because of the open borders has somehow is somehow as the result of wanting stronger borders. I mean, that's the kind of bizarre backwards thinking that you have.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's important. If anybody is unaware, maybe you're not as deep into European politics, the right wing, and I'm very careful about some of these parties I'm about to mention do have extremist elements, but the media is very, very clear to paint them all with the same broad brush. Essentially, they say they're all white supremacists, they're all radical right wing. They want to have, Nazi Germany. This is the kind of rhetoric that's used against them. It's a full on 100% propaganda attack on anything that is, I mean, a 1 degree right of center. They're all everything. If you're 1 degree right of center on any issue, and it doesn't even matter that a lot of these parties actually stand up. One of their big points that they bring to their rallies or their speeches is the defense of the LGBT community, but that's ignored, even though that's a left issue. If they're
Right.
right of center on any other issue, especially national integrity, border integrity, cultural issues, they're painted as radical right wing extremists. But that title doesn't seem to be deterring people from joining them. So we have quite a number of parties. In the Netherlands, we have the Party for Freedom that's led by Geert Wilders. That's been around for several years now, but it's been gaining strength. And Greece, there's the Golden Dawn Party. They're a little bit more controversial. Germany has the Alternative for Deutschland. France, the Front National, Marine Le Pen is the leader there, and she's as popular as ever. These groups are gaining in strength, and it's not a giant mystery as to why. People seem to be fed up with the EU policies across the entire continent, and it will be determined to see how fed up people are and how successful I believe the propaganda is in getting people corralled back into line.
That's right. And it's what this is people don't like to use this word. It's one of those banned words, but what this is a secession. And what's interesting is the people obviously that supported leave, the pro-secessionists were, as you were saying, were branded all of these horrible things, everything from racist to um, they all said that they were all calling these people racist and somehow fascist, and but at the same time they also turn around and support now Scotland, who voted to remain in the United Kingdom. Now they're supporting them leaving the United Kingdom. So it's this weird. It's like, well, your secession equals racism and fascism, and secession equals bad when it goes against what I want. But it's okay when you're not a racist and you're not a secessionist if you support Scotland separating from the United Kingdom.
And what that really amounts to is I want what I want, and I want it by any means necessary. That's what it amounts to. They don't
Right.
care about the process. They don't care about democracy. They want to get what they want.
Right, and there's no consistency. Like I said, the people who support, in generally, the people who support leave have a core philosophy behind their vote. But the people who vote to remain, a lot of them do not, as evidenced by they'll support staying in the European Union, but vote or support Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. There's no core philosophy of I disagree with your choice of self-determination, but it's your choice. And if Scotland wants to leave the United Kingdom, that's up to them. But uh, there's no core philosophy behind it. And I think the problem is that if you have a core philosophy, if you have consistency, that is when you're labeled as all these horrible names.
I want to share at this point when we're talking about these alternative parties and what's going on in Europe. This is a link that I will put in the description. It's from The Guardian, so make of it what you will. But they have a graphic here, a chart, which lists the is EU membership good or bad for your country. Now this was I'm looking for the poll information. Actually, I don't see it listed right here, but just going down the list, it has the EU average in the middle, and right at the average, according to this, is about 56% or so say EU membership is good for my country. A bad thing, they say, is about, well, a little less than 10%, and then there's a good, the remainder is uncertain. But when you go down from the average, I'll just start listing nations. All of these nations are below the EU average as far as saying that the EU is a good thing for their country. And it starts with France, and they have right around a little bit above 50%. Then Portugal drops to a little low, about around 50, a little bit below. Same for Croatia, Slovakia, Latvia, the UK, right in that range. Bulgaria, Hungary, Greece, Slovenia, and then it drops. Italy is down around 40%. Cyprus is 37%. Austria is right around the same. The Czech Republic a little bit lower, around 35%. Now, none of these countries listed actually list a bad thing as more than a good thing. So they're saying, well, there's still a majority that are saying the EU is good for their country, but there's a lot at the bottom that have an undecided number in there. And I think that if you look at this list and you see that UK is not very far at all away from the sentiment that is shared in France, Portugal, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Austria. These are major European nations. If they have referendums in these other countries, it could very well go the same route as the UK.
Well, that's interesting. Is there a breakdown on like Eastern European countries and their preferences? Because I would think that Eastern European countries, some of them would be more likely to want to leave, such as Poland, which has strong ties to the United Kingdom through immigration and work visas and whatnot. But or not visas, but the equivalent of it. Is there a breakdown of that?
It does not have a breakdown that way, but Poland is listed. They are well above the EU average. They are
Okay.
around the low 60%, and I've actually seen some other sources that indicate that as well. What's interesting about that, I think that I don't know if they're, and I don't know enough about Eastern European politics, but I could speculate. They seem to be interested in being a part of the EU, but they also seem to dislike some of the EU's policies very vehemently. And if anybody's not aware, Poland and Hungary have come out both as being very anti-migration, essentially refusing to take in anyone. And they're not even nations that are, well, Hungary is to a certain extent, but Poland hasn't really been affected much by the migrant crisis. They preemptively essentially said, we're not taking people. So I'm
Right.
not sure what's going on there exactly.
And I would like to, I'm not sure if this also shows that, but the the lesser European countries, Estonia and some of the ones that you just don't think of, I would think that they would have more of an incentive to stay in the European Union, and the stronger economically and just nationalist countries, United Kingdom, France, would have more of an incentive to leave, because I think these smaller countries rely on European Union regulations to help their economies, but I'm not sure if that shows any breakdown like that.
There's a, you can review the data. I'll send it to you. But I don't want to go too in depth off of just one piece of information because there's a lot of misinformation out there. I don't want to take it too seriously, but it
Right.
is an interesting snapshot to at least consider. Way I see it, I have two scenarios, well, two and a half, I guess, just that I've been thinking about over the past couple of days. So going back to Scotland and Northern Ireland, but specifically Scotland, they have been they have a large presence in the Scottish. I think it's the Scottish Independence Party is the name of it. That they won a lot in the last UK election, and but they have not succeeded in actually exiting the UK. They failed at that. For every time that they voted, they failed at it. Now I think that they have the Scottish independence movement is going to have a a big advantage the next time they vote, because a lot of people want to stay. I think it was 60 some percent in Scotland wanted to stay in the EU. So they may use that to, of course, suggest, well, we can declare independence and then rejoin with the EU. And I think it's very important to note that if that occurs, that the UK will essentially be returning to its medieval state of status. Um, and that's pretty significant coming from the largest empire in the world not too long ago. Um,
Right.
the so I see if the EU, or I'm sorry, if Scotland secedes and rejoins with the EU, I think what'll happen is the EU will dump all kinds of subsidy money and favor money into Scotland and do everything that they can to very subtly, under the radar, under the mainstream media, very subtly punish what's left of the UK any way that they can, through trade agreements, through trying to dump migrants on them. Whatever they will do it to punish them. Um, I think that in a worst case scenario, if the secession does not move through other EU member states, if something happens or the nationalist movements just don't gain enough steam and the EU stays cohesive and Scotland leaves and the EU punishes essentially England and Wales and Northern Ireland if they don't secede as well, you'll see the destruction of what's left of the UK. I think it'll become a minor player on the world stage pretty quickly. On the other hand, and do you have any thoughts on that scenario before I go on?
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see the European Union basically conduct a trade war with, let's just assume England and Wales. Forget about, let's assume that Scotland and Northern Ireland go into the European Union. I could absolutely see a trade war going on. And it might depend on what happens in the United States. If there's a Donald Trump presidency, I could definitely see the England being bolstered by that. And basically, I would assume that Donald Trump would help England stand up to the European Union, contrary to what Hillary Clinton would do. So I could definitely see that. But at the same time, because England is where it is, because it's a island on the westernmost side of the continent. I What people need to understand is the smaller the political unit, the smaller the country, the more trade it has to do because it can't do everything. It's basically the national or the international division of labor. So, people think that by going away from the European Union, that they can become some kind of isolationist country, but that's not true. They'll have to trade more, which on one hand, that could hurt them with the European Union, but at the same time, it could also open up new trade avenues with Asia and potentially the United States or South America.
Oh,
So,
I think you're
def-
absolutely correct there.
well, exactly, and just because the European Union, its purpose is to protect its own industries at the expense of others. So England could look at this as an opportunity to say, yeah, we'll still trade with the European Union if they'll have us, but now we're free from those regulations and the shackles of those regulations, and it can open up new trade avenues if we want them for countries that were previously cut off or made harder to trade with because of the regulations. So I think it's a double-edged sword, but I could definitely see the European Union take out retribution on England.
And I think that you're absolutely correct in that regard, but I think that that would depend on, like you said, who wins the presidency in the United States. That's a big factor because Donald Trump has basically praised the UK people for leaving the EU. He has made it known that he is anti-establishment in the continent of Europe as well. He doesn't think too favorably on the EU and some of their policies, which isn't too surprising. And I remembered hearing some kind of a quote by Hillary Clinton, but I don't recall it now. She's obviously in favor of EU, just like Obama. Obama essentially went over there and threatened the UK people before they took their
Well,
vote.
just as a quick side note, that's probably what helped the Leave side the most, is Obama going over there and threatening them, saying they'll be back at the line if they vote to leave. coupled with everybody calling the Leave supporters racist. I mean, if you want somebody to be persuaded by your argument, you do not want to threaten them or call them names. Otherwise, they're not going to be persuaded by your argument.
Right. Absolutely.
So,
But I think that the trade policy and where the UK can go in the future, I could still see a potential future where the UK is knocked into I'm not talking like knocked into a condition of like Somalia, but knocked into a minor player role, maybe something along the lines of Portugal or Hungary, not attacking those countries, but a minor role, much more minor than what it used to be, if you have a Washington EU alliance, because they're going to be signing a lot of big trade deals. And just like some of the other trade deals that have gone through recently, sometimes they're able to get quite a large number of nations on board with some pretty insidious things. I mean, you look at the trade war that we're under the radar that we have against Russia right now. I could see something very similar going on against the UK potentially.
yes, and that will be something. I think if that happens, we won't. It'll be a couple of years, I think, before we see that. We really have to wait to see when the actual um, the leave takes place, because right now it has to go through Parliament, and I think it'll also depend on who the Prime Minister is. If it's Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage, then you may definitely, because I mean, just recently Farage went in front of the European Parliament and trashed them in a brilliant way. And if he gets to be prime minister, or Boris Johnson, then you will see, I think, retribution. But it depends on who is put in. If it's a more moderate voice who may be willing to work more with the European Union, I think that depends on who the prime minister is as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. There are so many variables in play right now. Absolutely. So that's my worst case kind of scenario. The UK becomes a second world power, essentially gets knocked down the food chain and is attacked and berated by the EU and the US alliance. There is, of course, the alternative for that, and we were just talking about the rise of alternative political parties in the continental Europe. So perhaps there are more countries that could leave the EU. There are quite a few candidates there are major political parties in several major European nations right now that are calling for referendums. They want referendums set. So if that happens and more leave, that will start a cascade. I think there's two possibilities that could come out of that. One is the total dissolving of the EU eventually, or as I make the joke, perhaps they'll just relocate its capital in Turkey, since Turkey is so desperate to join the EU. Maybe they'll just keep moving it further into the Middle East.
Well, we saw what happened in Turkey. Was it this morning or yesterday at this point?
Yesterday.
And yeah, unfortunately, that's just, it's going to keep coming. It's going to keep migrating west, and you'll see more of that. It's just another. I mean, this is part of the problem. This is part of the reason why the people of the United Kingdom, or at least England and Wales, don't want this. And it's not about what color your skin is. It's about what you bring to the table. And if you bring violence and disorder, then that's part of the rejection.
Absolutely. The other possibility I see is if the EU does not completely dissolve, I could envision a potential future where Europe is essentially split down two alliances. One, the anti-EU alliance, and one, the pro-EU alliance. And I could envision this very quickly turning into a very tense situation where you maybe have nations that are allied with one another that are nationalist, that I'm talking a few years down the road now, but they've essentially had their more nationalist governments come to power, and they are allied with each other. And on the other hand, you have the more globalist perspective of the EU trying to retain and recapture its power. And I could even see the potential far down the road, at least the potential that that could turn into a violent situation. Although I don't want to speculate too much on that, but EU is fragmenting at this point. We don't know exactly how it's going to fragment, but let's face it, there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems in the Western world in general, the United States, EU, or Europe, I should say, and even in Canada to a certain extent, we have some serious, serious problems. And the longer these problems go by and aren't resolved, the more likely we're going to see changes and more extreme solutions thrown on the table.
Right. And depending on how this goes and how the immigration or the migration goes in the countries that, or at least in the United Kingdom, that choose to leave the European Union, within the countries that want to remain, the globalist countries, you may have infighting there too, like you already have with the refugees and the migrants moving in, and those countries may be torn apart regardless of what the European, or the United Kingdom does. So you're going to have internal wars in these countries that they'll have to worry about as well. I mean, we're starting to see it now, and it's only going to get worse at the current rate.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that it does actually worry me across Western civilization, not just in Europe, in the United States too. It seems like our entire civilization is being prepared for a massive civil unrest. Like I feel that it is very likely that we could see in the near future violent unrest within our nations that have been stable for quite some time. And we're not talking about in the past where we see world wars. We go off and you fight this nation, that nation fights that. That's what happens when you have nationalism go a little bit too far. Sometimes nations that shouldn't fight each other end up fighting each other, like World War One and World War Two, which I think were both had a lot of there was a lot of pointlessness to those wars. There was a lot of destruction and cannibalism of the civilized world. That can happen if people take things a little too far and they're not thinking logically. Absolutely. But mixing everybody together in a multicultural society and expecting them to get along may turn out to be nastier, because we're looking at the potential of quite a number of fragmented groups within our own civilization potentially violently confronting each other. And that is a very scary thought, because we have a lot of people. There's a lot of people in Europe. There's a lot of people in the United States. A lot of people that are not so logical and willing to enact violence before talking about things. And it does worry me a little bit as to see how much discontent can be sown and how far it can reach. I would definitely like to see peaceful solutions to this. I don't want to see chaos descend on any of the advanced nations of the world. It would be nice to see internal reforms and peaceful solutions and rational solutions taken so that we can avoid those reoccurring historic problems. Because if that does occur, it's not going to be just a problem for the Western world. It's going to be a problem for everybody dependent on the Western world for foreign aid, trade, intervention, etc.
Well, that's right, and I think that's what the Western tradition brings to us, are peaceful and diplomatic solutions to these problems. I'm just afraid it's going to get to the point where a normally and generally peaceful and diplomatic society or culture is backed into a corner, and their hand may be forced to use violence. I don't know. I hope that doesn't happen, but it's something that we'll find out over the next decade or two.
Yes, absolutely, and it is very unfortunate. I've even heard people openly talk at times, just in casual conversation, half joking, oh, we need a revolution or whatever. And some of them seem half serious, and I don't think people really understand the ramifications of what it means when you have internal war in your own country. It's not something that happens, over there. It happens in your backyard, and that's not a good thing. It is People look at the American Revolution and say, oh, we fight for freedom. And the American Revolution had a lot of brutality in it, let's not forget. It was a war. But that's not the norm. Usually, revolutions and civil war are absolutely brutal and crippling, not just socially, economically, politically, but the very resolve of people can be crushed in such brutal engagement. So we really don't want to go down that route, which is why we need to emphasize more than ever for people to just think rationally, exercise critical thinking, use diplomacy and dialogue, talk, discuss, think, come up with conclusions that are based on reason and evidence. Don't just go out there, get angry, and attack people in protests.
I mean, and that's what people need to realize is the people, the pro leave in the United Kingdom did this peacefully. They did it through the democratic system. They did it through a diplomatic referendum. They did not use violence, and that's what people need to understand. Is people call these the leave voters and campaigners fascists and racists, but these people did it in a peaceful way, and that's important. That people need to understand that that is the Western tradition. I mean, what other civilization, if you want to, I mean, generally speaking, there are always exceptions, but what other civilization do you have a peaceful secession?
Absolutely. It's very much an anomaly in history. And again, I emphasize anybody out there listening who is inclined, study history. There is a reason why you study history. It's not to memorize dates, as a lot of people seem to think. The dates are irrelevant. What you look for is the trends, what happened and why. Once you learn that, you can see these cycles repeating and stop them.
That's right.
Okay, would you like to say, wrapping up, would you like to say anything else about this issue?
Just maybe if you want to join me for a minute or two and talk about a the possibilities for the United States as the outcome of Brexit.
Certainly. Let's
Um,
talk about that.
yeah, let's. Well, I'm specifically thinking of potential secession movements in the United States. I mean, Texas specifically is there's a new hashtag on Twitter called Texit, which it's not the first time that secession sentiments have been brought up in Texas. And is it likely in the near future? No, but do you do you think that we can see states like Texas or New Hampshire or some of these very, I mean, let's take it down from a nationalist, just from a state being very proud of your state and your state's heritage, especially Texas. Do you think that will rub off in some way in the United States?
I want to touch on just something you said there about taking pride in your state. And I think that there's something embedded in that we can take away from this. And that is, if we think about it, even in Texas, and Texans have their pride. I mean, certain states do, California, New York, New Jersey. No offense, but I'm not sure I'm sure why anyone's proud of being from New Jersey. But no, but
Exactly.
people do have um, they have their regional pride. But I think that when you talk about secession sentiments or suggestions in the United States, the overwhelming reason why they exist is not regional pride. I think it's total disgust with the centralized leadership. Um, I don't know very many people, or of many people, not that I know them personally, but just generally speaking, movements in the media, anything along those lines. I don't know very many that are centered around regional pride. They're all centered around getting away from what they call Washington corruption.
Right, right. And it'll be interesting to see if Brexit, at least in the long term, leads to something in the United States, because the United States, people need to understand, was founded as it wasn't the United States, it was these United States, as in uh, every state was a separate political entity rather than what we see now is just each state is basically an arm of the federal government, an administrator of the federal government. It'll be interesting to see if we can go sort of slowly roll back the tide of central power in Washington, D.C., and go back to what the country was founded as. And I think you'll see, at least to a small extent, more nullification, where the states nullify any kind of federal law. And you'll see that coming in the future.
I think that it is it is quite possible that we could see secession movements in the United States, but I think that it's unlikely. I think that for that to occur, the situation in the United States would have to deteriorate tremendously, and that's totally possible. That could totally occur, and maybe there would be secession at that point. But I just the United States government has so much corruption, so much corruption. I laugh when I look at the corruption indexes for the countries, and the United States is like way at the top. We're so low on corruption. That's because all the corruption is done where it's not noticed. The bribes and the handouts and the purchasing of politics and favors is all done in very difficult to measure ways. It's very much there. um,
Right.
so I think that it could potentially happen, but I think that it is probably just as likely that the United States could descend into a civil war. Uh, because
Right.
yeah, I don't see that. I think that Washington is such a hegemon at this point. The capital is such a hegemon at this point that I believe that they would do everything in their power to retain their central authority.
And I agree with that. I think it's unlikely you will have secession movements, and that'll be interesting though to see if, let's say, Texas vote the Texas legislature supports secession with the approval of the governor, and I don't know, the Texas National Guard. They're all behind it, and they move to do that, and the Washington D.C. goes in to violently stop it. And you'll see, I think that'll be a wake up call to people to say, I think there's a lot of idea in this country that you can't secession. That was settled back in the what I call the War of Northern Aggression. But, it's, we'll see, when there's peaceful people being bloodied by, I mean, look at Kent State, that in the 60s. I mean, when you have an arm of the federal government hurting peaceful people in a state, I mean, that might be a wake up call, but I don't know. But yeah, it's unlikely, but Brexit has certainly spawned these secession movements, and with the wave of populist nationalism that Donald Trump has brought to the political scene, it'll be interesting to see if that gets any ground at all.
And I think that what you're really touching on here with Brexit is a four-letter word that's not so bad to say. It's called hope. Um, we
Right.
we meaning people, rational people, and not necessarily affiliated with right or left or any political organization, but people who are genuinely concerned for our own communities and nations, have had a hard time finding hope for quite some time. It's been very bleak. And what Brexit did was it showed us that even by a very slim margin of victory, it is still possible to achieve some of these lasting goals and major nation changing events. It is possible. The opposition is not so strong that they have brainwashed enough people, that they have controlled enough media, that they have had enough payoffs and underhanded dealings that they can't be overcome. And that is very, very important. A lot of people realize, and myself included, that yes, of course, we do have the power. We just have to take the power. If we want the government to change, we need to tell them that we demand change. But a lot of people don't see it that way. And the Brexit vote has opened a lot of eyes, I think, to that. And they really understand, wait a minute, this is not so fatalistic. We can change our communities if we truly want to. And that legacy of the Brexit vote is going to be very, very important moving forward. If we're talking about the United States, we're talking about Europe, anywhere in the Western world, and even beyond to a certain degree. Change is possible, even if it seems very unlikely. And let's face it, the media, the government of the UK before the Brexit vote, they were pounding away anything that they possibly could to try to change public opinion. Whether it was the polls that they were releasing, whether it was the stories they were covering, that awful story where they used the murder, or I think was it she that was murdered? A public official over there was murdered.
A member of the European Parliament.
European
Yes.
Parliament. Thank you. I didn't have the details on that, but I read it when it happened, and that was used as a propaganda stunt to try to attack people who wanted to leave the EU. I mean, all these underhanded tactics, and they failed. They failed in that. So it's very important that we remember going forward that these things can be achieved. They require diligence, they require organization, they require discussing, talking, going out, doing what we're doing right now, talking about this issue. Go out, don't be afraid, talk to people, be rational, discuss these things, and change can definitely occur. It can be made to happen. And that's what I think the real takeaway here, and why this has left such an enthusiasm in people's minds, is that it means hope. It means hope, because all the people who've been watching this deterioration and this police state growing, and the new, the European army that they're looking to put together, and you see this growing and growing, and after a while you become a little bit fatalistic. It's like, will anything stop this? Well, the British people did, so we can thank them for giving us some hope.
Exactly, and how ironic that it is that the British, of all countries, are going to teach the United States about how to take control back from a foreign power, basically. But yeah, it is. It's a vote about. It was a vote, and it's a movement about people saying that things don't have to be the way that Brussels tells us. We can make our own destiny. We will make our own destiny, and we will have the power in our own hands. And I just encourage people to truly keep an open mind. If you think that Brexit supporters, voters, campaigners are racist and fascist, if you come to that conclusion, I think you're wrong, but if you come to that conclusion after genuinely talking with these people and studying the issue and not relying on mainstream media or politicians' narratives, that's all I can ask for, is just keep an open mind. These are just genuine, hardworking people who just want to enjoy their what's left of their working and middle class lives before the European Union strangles it from them.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would actually say that I don't find it too ironic that this is coming from the UK, because let's face it, even though we declared independence from them all those many years ago, they are that is the culture that brought us the Enlightenment. That's the culture that brought us industrialization, and that is the culture that brought us the Magna Carta.
I was going to say that is true. The Magna Carta, which arguably started the every positive aspect of Western civilization, the rights of individuals, the freedom, the liberties that we enjoy today, and at least most of us, at least in Western cultures.
All right. Well, do you have anything else that you'd like to end before we wrap up, or end on?
I think that's it. It's been a great conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So, congratulations if you're in the UK and you're listening to this by chance, congratulations. Our thoughts and hearts go out to you from the United States, and we hope to see more positive news coming from that region of the world very soon, whether it's continental or otherwise. As always, thank you for listening, and as always, remember that this channel is supposed to be listener/viewer driven. So if you want us to talk about this issue further, let us know what subset of issues you'd like us to look at. If you'd like us to go into greater detail on anything, for instance, the right-wing parties in Europe or trade in Europe, trade agreements, the United States and the EU, any of these issues, just let us know in the comments section and we'll review that and get back to you as soon as we can.